QB1 has tied the knot, and we are having the James Cook conversation today on the Wandering Buffalo podcast.
You're now listening to the Wandering Buffalo podcast with your host, Justin Goddard.
Bills Mafia, welcome into another episode of the Wandering Buffalo podcast, a show on the Buffalo Fanbase Podcast Network. My name is Justin, and I'm your host as always. And today we have a little bit of off-the-field Bills news, but also a difficult conversation to have in the James Cook conversation. And we've gotten into that a little bit on this show, but I'm going to kind of try to, in real time, work through all my thoughts that I have on that conversation and see where I end up predictively for what I think the Bills will do and what I would do if I had the choice, if that's something different. Before we get into that, some off the field news. We do have QB1 tying the knot, which this isn't something that I get super excited about or anything. These guys are all people. They have their personal lives. I don't try not to get into that too much. But I will say super happy for Josh and Haley and hope the best for them. I do think it's a crazy time to be alive as a Bills fan when we look at all of the history that we had. Especially, I'm turning 35 this year, so the good majority of my life was spent with a team that was really bad. Players didn't want to come here, yada yada yada. So to have one of the top few best players in the league marrying a Hollywood superstar, all that, it's kind of a crazy time to be alive. The one thing that I will really say on this is just the kind of way that hopefully it works out for them as well. But when I kind of apply this to my own personal life and thinking about, Josh sitting at, I believe it's 29 right now, and kind of similar vein to my life of around the time where I got married to my wife and how much my life has changed and how much growing up I did and improving on my life once I found that person and, kind of stopped living that single life, and just a lot of growing up, a lot of maturing to do. And I think that having met my wife was a huge factor into me coming out as the person I am right now, who I'm much more happy with the person I am today than, 5, 10 years ago. Um, so hopefully, that applies to Josh Allen as well. He continues maturing and developing and coming out of this marriage ends up the best version of himself. And we see that on and off the football field. And the version of himself that he was already quite an amazing person on and off the field. So we'll keep ascending there. Kind of moving into this James Cook conversation, I was kind of led here in a conversation with one of my good buddies who is an Eagles fan, and we kind of started started with one thing and kind of evolved into, do we think that given the right infrastructure around us, we could create a successful team as a general manager or run a successful team as a head coach? And that was like, provided that we had an A1 scouting department and we just had to take what they gave us and make selections, or for the head coach, we had A1 coordinators all around us and we just had to be the leaders. And kind of which one would we end up better at, or do we think that we could do? And I landed more in the general manager category. And, was kind of laying out my hard and fast rules of, I would always try to pair like a premier wide receiver and pretty much all of these premium positions, wide receiver, cornerback, edge, maybe tackle. Basically, I would try to pair all of these positions with a paid proven veteran, and I would constantly be drafting, a young player to go with them. As this young player gets ready for their second contract, hopefully they're ready to take over for that aging proven talent. You move them for assets, rinse and repeat. So you always have eh, like a paid cornerback one, a paid top paid wide receiver, and you're able to pair them with young talent. That's a whole conversation for a different day, but basically led us into the conversation about, well, what do you do with running back? And kind of my stance on this conversation has always been that it is a lot more to do with your offensive line. Running backs are dime a dozen. You can find guys that can be successful if you have a good line in front of them. And basically, that I would not be very in favor of giving running backs a second contract. The caveat kind of being there, like bona fide proven talent that can play 75% of the snaps, doesn't have a crazy injury history. And I kind of landed on like basically Saquon and Derrick Henry and not being too many other players in the league. But then that brings us into the conversation with James Cook. And admittedly, these hard and fast rules without names to attach to them are much easier than, you know, actively sitting here as a Bills fan and being ready to move on from James Cook, whether it's this year, next year, whatever. So kind of wanted to this has been kind of a conversation that I've been saving, seeing how it plays out, saving it for a rainy day, not much going on. And just kind of want to get my thoughts out there as they stand now. And I will put the caveat on this conversation that I move around on this conversation a lot as to what I think I want, how I think it'll play out, and I think it kind of speaks to the difficulty of the situation between the team and James Cook right now and kind of the nuance of the conversation. So, I mean, uh, pretty easy low-hanging fruit if you are a fan of the Buffalo Bills and you've watched them over the last couple of years, you've seen James Cook develop as a player. I think it's pretty difficult to find a lot of people that just straight up taking money out of the equation. Do you want James Cook here or not? Would be in favor of James Cook being gone. So, I mean, ultimately, what this comes down to is completely 100% a conversation of money and value propositions. And very, very fair, right? The NFL is a limited resource organization. There's a salary cap. You have to get all these guys under it. You have to place priorities on different positions, where you want to spend money, what assets you have to spend to replace that player, on and on and on. And for me, I will start with, a lot of people saying that, 15 million is too high. It should be more like 12 and a half. And then hearing like, well, if you're going to do 12 and a half, aren't you just kind of splitting hairs here? Like just give them the 15 and call it a day. And I do think it is important to note just how many players exist in the Bills organization and across the NFL that, you bring in for a 1 year small deal or a 2 year deal. And the first year might be, a couple $1 million cap hit, and the second year balloons, things like that. there's not a ton of players on the Bills roster that their cap hit this year is more than that value. So I would caution that conversation of it's just 2.5 million. It's not a big deal. Blah blah blah. When it comes to the roster building and having to get 53 guys under contract and have funds to be able to play with for injuries that happen throughout the season, it is really a proposition where every dollar matters, especially when you're a team like the Bills that are basically coming into every season over the cap and playing with the cap to get back under. So the dollars do matter. What my perspective is kind of predictively from the Bills organization trying to figure out what kind of value that Brandon Beane places not only on James Cook, but the running back position. And in his tenure in Buffalo, we've seen him give pretty substantial draft assets towards the running back position. You're talking Devin Singletary with a third-round pick. You're talking Zach Moss was a third-round pick. James Cook being a second-round pick. Ray Davis, a fourth-round pick. So I think from that perspective, you'd be hard-pressed to say that Brandon Beane doesn't particularly value the position. I think he's shown with his draft allocation that he does value the position. Now, does he value the position enough to pay the running back? Well, we've seen that in his tenure thus far, he hasn't paid any running backs. And I think that's kind of a more difficult conversation in that maybe Singletary wasn't exactly who you wanted him to turn out to be. Zach Moss wasn't much of a player here in Buffalo. James Cook's the one we're dealing with right now, and Ray Davis, promising rookie year. That's conversation for another time. So I don't think it's necessarily a conversation where we can just say that Brandon Beane, cut and dry, plain and simple, just isn't going to pay running backs. I think Singletary and Moss left a lot to be desired, and that played into them not getting a second contract. The other piece of this conversation that I hear brought up a lot is the Bills not trusting James Cook in pass protection. So we don't see him on passing downs. We don't see him in 2-minute situations where he's asked to pass protect. And this is kind of a conversation that I was falling into, admittedly, and kind of the more time I've spent with where would I go with this contract, how would I play it out, and just kind of listening to and consuming a lot of other content to try to fully develop my thoughts. I was listening to the Bills Squad, and if you haven't listened to this show yet, highly recommend it. It's coming out on the Locked On Bills podcast feed. If you're not already there, if you're not already listening to Joe Marino, I thank you for making your way to this show, but please do also listen to Locked On Bills. Joe Marino is one of the GOATs in the game. In this Bills squad, he's teamed up with Jeremy White from WGR and Jerry Ostrowski, former Bills player. And Jerry was talking about this idea that the Bills don't trust him in pass protection and kind of broke down the numbers of how much the Bills actually ask the running backs to pass protect versus how much they're out in routes, and kind of brought up the point that one of the big reasons that James Cook was drafted was he came out of college with a really great receiving profile, and we've seen that kind of be a mixed bag in his tenure with the Bills. And the point Jerry was bringing up, and this was kind of in the do we pay him or not conversation, was maybe not that the Bills don't trust him in pass pro, but more so they like what they're seeing in the passing game from Ray Davis and Ty Johnson so much that it's exceeding how they feel about James Cook in the passing game. And I think there is some credence to that, in that I expected James Cook to be much more of a weapon in the passing game, and he's ultimately ended up more of a consistent down to down running back than I expected, and less of a pass threat than I expected coming into the league. So maybe that's one of the factors of, if we go into this year, James Cook shows up, he doesn't hold out, he plays out the season. What can he do to make Brandon Beane more comfortable with giving him that money? And this isn't to say that we haven't seen James Cook be effective in the passing game. We have. But we've also seen quite a few pretty bad drops on plays that could have been, walk-in touchdowns. Meanwhile, we're seeing Ty Johnson make these crazy acrobatic wide receiver one looking catches in the back of the end zone. And it maybe then becomes more of a conversation of, do we have to replace a full skill set if we don't bring James Cook back? Or are we kind of looking for, just a more consistent runner with some breakaway speed, and we have the passing game covered in both pass protection and receiving backs out of the backfield? And I do think that is a big factor that could keep James Cook here. If we see him, play out this year, really become a weapon in the passing game, able to stay on the field a little bit more in third downs, but still kind of rocks with that split share that we saw. It was kind of 50% James Cook, 25 for Ray Davis and Ty Johnson. And I think that's how you're going to get the most effective backfield for this team. And I think that would be the ideal situation to keep the numbers there. I think that's how you're going to get the most production. I think you're going to have the most success with all your running backs there. So what do I think happens with James Cook? I think, if I'm being predictive, I do think, first of all, we see that he's not at OTAs. I would project for the beginning end of this that we do see him show up once things are mandatory. We do see him play out this season. I think kind of the leverage of him holding out and not playing this year, I don't think there's a ton of benefit for him. He gets, bonuses for playing as well as he did last year, which I think he's got something like $5 million on the table that he stands to lose if he doesn't play this year. So I would say I don't think we see a contract get done before the season. I think that it's a season where he shows up, Brandon Beane wants him to play out the year, and we go from there. So I do think this ends up being more of a conversation that, unfortunately, we have to deal with going into next season. And I think there's going to be so many layers to this that will be interesting to see how it plays out, because we've never really had people like holding out of activities because of contracts. We've had some big stuff along the way of like missing OTAs and stuff, but that's about it. For the most part, it's been draft, develop, resign, and I mean, Tremaine Edmonds would be kind of the big one that I would point to here for that didn't go that way. But I think that was a much more think that was a much more polarizing conversation of people that really liked what Edmonds brought to the team and people that really thought he was a disappointment. And there was huge swings back and forth there. I think with this James Cook conversation, it's generally he's been a very good player. We would love to see him back on the team. And the conversation is much more centered around where do we place the value on that player? So I will say this. If we go into this offseason and it plays out as James Cook plays similar to what we saw this past season, maybe the touchdown numbers come back down to earth a little bit, those pretty crazy touchdown numbers. And maybe in exchange for the touchdowns, you get a little bit more effect in the passing game. I could see a world where Brandon Beane is willing to sign that contract next year. And I think one of the big things here isn't necessarily Cook's number of 15. I think it's probably more to do with terms of the contract and probably wanting it to be, like 4 years, 60 million in X amount of money guaranteed. I could see us getting to this time next year and Brandon being willing to give that 15 million. And that's kind of predicated on the cap going up. Other players are going to get paid. We make this a 4-year deal and we have maybe an out somewhere along the way that, if we get 2 years into the contract and it's not aging well, you can go out and get another contract elsewhere. We can cut ties and not have a huge cap hit. I think my issue with that strategy is if it goes into next year, does Cook's number go up to 20? And are we having this same conversation where like cap's gone up, the value of that 15 has changed, and like now we're comfortable with like, yeah, we'd give him 15, but now he wants 20. So I think if we see again a healthy season, similar results, productive, bring something in the passing game, and the Bills are overall, a pretty successful team, I could see 15 being a number that's in play next year. My concern there is that cap goes up. That money plus some could exist somewhere else for a player like Cook, and he, goes and chases down the money in, I don't know, Miami or Las Vegas has been my go-to for so long, but they just drafted Ashton Jetty. But maybe one of these teams that needs to bring in talent, has some cap to play with, and is willing to take a swing on a player. I think the whole game changer of this conversation would be if the Bills win the Super Bowl. I think if the Bills win the Super Bowl this year, you're not in a hurry to bring back James Cook. You've bought yourself some grace. You can, make some pivots. You can be willing to take a step back in some talent in some areas and retool. You have the grace of having won a Super Bowl and you bought yourself a lot of runway. I think if they do win the Super Bowl, kind of regardless of the season that Cook has, that I don't think it's likely that he's brought back. I think they would move Ray Davis up. You still got Ty Johnson under contract for another year. Maybe you're drafting the guy. Maybe you're paying, a lesser veteran to kind of complement the room. Now for what I would do. And this is, again, as I stand now, I try to not be too wishy-washy with my opinions, but they are allowed to change based on new information that I'm given. And I would say as of right now, I would still be trying to get a deal done with Cook before the season. And I do think the 15 million is a little bit high for me. And I do think that, we're going to get into the conversation of, are we splitting hairs with 12 and a half, and what does that look like? Whatever. And what I would try to be doing with James Cook is get him on a multi-year deal, maybe slap some void years on the end of it that you can spread out a cap hit a little bit, and maybe it on paper looks like a 5-year contract, but the money is kind of spread out, so it's more of a 3-year contract with some dead money, and you're able to kind of make it look like the average value is something like $15 million, but you also have a way to get out of it. And I know that I started this conversation with, I would pay a very small select amount of running backs a second contract. And here I am 20 minutes later saying that I would pay James Cook. And the reason there are a couple reasons that I would do this. And the first of them being, I think that the Bills are already leaning into some of relying on Josh Allen being a unicorn, in that they're not investing huge dollars in aggressively moving up in the draft to get him receivers. We did see, a move up for Kincaid. We did see an investment in Coleman, but it's not like they went out and gave, like, attacked the Devontae Adams in free agency. They're not making these huge swing trades for DK Metcalf. They're making moderate investments in Josh Palmer and, Curtis Samuel last year, and some of these like mid-tier contracts. I do think that at a certain point, you do need some like superstar caliber players around him. And the big investments have really gone towards the offensive line. And I think that's a whole nother layer to this conversation of McGovern's up for a contract. Are you thinking about extending Torrance? What are you doing with David Edwards? And I think that's kind of where the investments have been. And Beane talks about building through the trenches. And I think that makes sense. I think you can insert a lot of running backs that would be successful behind this offensive line. But what I think you're truly missing on offense is explosive home run ability hitters that can kind of create for themselves, can make people miss and have the breakaway speed and snap off a 60-yard touchdown that ends up being a touchdown instead of tackled on the 20, and you still have to put together 3 more plays to score a touchdown. I don't think we have a lot of that talent in the room right now. And that is why I would lean towards, let's figure out getting this deal done and address some stuff later. Now, this conversation does change for me if you kind of go into this season, he plays it out, and going into 2026 offseason, that kind of becomes your priority. You've hit on some defensive picks in this past draft. The defense is getting to where you want it to be. You kind of like how it played out with some of your receivers, but you're willing to make a big investment there now. I think if you have that in your head as possibly your plan for 2026, then maybe you don't extend him now and you revisit it then on, where are we going to kind of get another superstar on this offense? So I think it's a very complicated conversation that I would love to just be able to do this like video game style and, take the personalities out of it, take the, you know, negotiating hard feelings out of it, the careful media conversations and all that, and just kind of have it be a straight X's and O's, which, obviously it's not that simple. I would lean again towards get this contract done with him now. Again, I don't think where they stand in negotiations right now that's going to happen. So visiting this in 2026, say the number has now, we'll call it's gone up to 18 is what Cook is looking for. My decision there is again going to depend on how the season plays out. And it would be from kind of a weapon standpoint. Again, what I'm really looking for here is who are the superstar impact playmakers on the offense, not named Josh Allen. And right now, outside of Cook, you don't really have that. And you have hopes and dreams and ifs and maybes. And, without, superstar talent last year, very successful offense, you did have that superstar in James Cook. Now, how does this year play out? There could be any number of factors of players that could take a step and become a superstar player for Josh Allen. And then I think this conversation with Cook becomes different. Maybe you can take a little step back and you can have Ray Davis be, a less dynamic but rounded skill set running back as your RB1. You still have Ty Johnson, you draft a guy, whatever. But over the course of this year, you've seen a young receiver in Joshua Palmer really get an opportunity with Josh Allen, and they really thrive together. You could see a revitalization from Elijah Moore. He's a guy that I liked a ton coming into the league. Thought he had a great rookie year with the Jets, and they kind of blew that up to, bring in all of Rodgers' buddies, and he's had bad quarterback play since. Maybe he resparks something in his career. I don't project him becoming a superstar, but these are a couple pretty young guys that haven't had great quarterback play, or for Joshua Palmer's situation, kind of buried behind some proven veteran receivers. We have Dalton Kincaid that could take a huge step in year 3 and become a superstar. We have Keon Coleman, who I know a lot of people are down on Coleman right now, but before his injury last year, he was balling out. He was right up there with these top name rookie receivers that everybody feels great about going into year 2. He struggled coming back from injury, but I'm not going to ignore what his first 9 games looked like. He could be somebody that steps up and becomes a reliable player for Josh Allen. I think really, if any of those guys catch fire, I have my superstar bucket getter guy that I can rely on, and it makes this moving on from James Cook conversation easier. But as it stands right now, outside of Josh Allen, I don't have that superstar playmaker in anybody but Cook. And for that reason, I would want him to stay around. That's my thoughts on the James Cook situation as it stands now. Like I said, going to try really hard not to be a flip-flopper on this, but this conversation is just getting started. We're going to have a ton of... This is going to be a conversation that I'm very comfortable that we're having for a full year into this, possibly this time next offseason. So as I see things from Cook and his agent and the Bills organization that tells me where they're leaning, there's going to be a lot of changing dynamics in this conversation. So hang in there, drop me a comment on what you think about the situation, what you might do with it. Always appreciate it if you like, share, most importantly, subscribe, tell a friend about the show. Make sure you're not missing any episodes as we're coming out all off season. I do appreciate you tuning in for this week's episode. We'll see you again next week. Until then, and as always, go Bills.